Hello, everyone. This is the lecture for Chapter 5, talking about measurement. So today we're going to talk about ways that we can measure variables. We're going to talk about how we can define if that measure is good using reliability and validity. And then we're going to finish by talking a little bit about construct validity. So first, one thing to remember is that when we're talking about measuring a variable, we got to start somewhere. And usually we're going to start with coming up with a conceptual definition of the variable. So for example, a guy, Dr. Diner, or also called Dr. Happiness, has spent most of his career studying happiness. He started understanding happiness by creating this definition: subjective well-being as being happiness. If you're feeling, your own perception is that you are doing well, then you must be happy. After that, they came up with a way to operationalize it. This is, how do we actually go about measuring it? In their case, they came up with this 5-item subjective well-being scale. So it was, they would ask these individuals, rate on a scale from 1 to 7 if you agree or disagree with this statement. There's a lot of other ways of doing this. This is true of gratitude, gender, wealth, intelligence, a bunch of other things. All these things we have to decide, first of all, what does it actually mean? And second, how do we measure it? So when it comes to measuring these, there's 3 main ways that we can measure them: self-report, observational, and physiological. So I was just part of a study that did all 3 of these. There was a study looking at how a certain psychological treatment, so a therapy, impacts an individual's anxiety. So the self-report measure was asking them, after receiving the therapy, how anxious do you feel? It was a couple items where they ranked, this is how I feel. So self-report is all about just asking them and them responding. These are often done in psychology. They're often done with several items. So we would say with anxiety, do you feel uptight? That could be one of the items of them rating anxiety. When it comes to observational, that could be, we put them into a situation where they might feel kind of anxious and we look at behavior. Do they resort to poor coping behavior in the anxious situation? So we're just watching them and we record what they do. So that's observational. This last one, physiological, we measured brain activity and heart rate. So we gave them the situation where they were going to feel anxious and we recorded, is their heart starting to race? Is their brain activity different? So physiological measures are the body's biological response. So all 3 of them can help paint a full picture. So on here I ask, which operationalization is best? Is one of those better than the other? Not necessarily. They all tell us different aspects of what we're trying to look at. There's an argument that self-report is the most important. If someone feels like they're not as anxious, that's a good thing. But we may also think, well, if their heart is still racing, that could still have bad health consequences. We could also say, well, if they're still doing poor coping mechanisms, then maybe they feel better right now, but maybe it won't last. So all of them are really good to tell us the full story. So among these, when we're going to measure, we can measure them as categorical or quantitative. Categorical, there are just a finite number of possible responses, and there's no order to them. So for example, I could ask, what kind of music is your favorite? And so you could say, well, my favorite is rock. I'm just really into that. And someone else says, well, they're really into country. So those are 2 different levels of what is the favorite. And it doesn't mean that country is better than rock or rock's better than country. They're just 2 different options. When it comes to quantitative, that means there's going to be more information in the measure, not just categories, but now, for example, ordinal, that just says we are ranking them. The difference between them isn't as important, but just ranking them. So for example, we could get the order of finishers in a swimming race. So were they in first place, second place, third place? We can get even more information with an interval variable. That's like an IQ score or shoe size. There's no true zero to it. So like the temperature. When we say the temperature is 70 degrees, that means something to us. When we say that it's 0 degrees, that means something to us, but it doesn't mean that there's no degrees. It just means it's really cold. So interval is this continuous scale where it measures something where you can have the distance between the numbers is meaningful. 1 degree up means something. But saying 0 degrees does not mean there's none degrees. It just means it's cold. Ratio is where if I say 0, it means there's none of them. So ratio says it's just like interval, but if I have 0 inches, then it really is no inches. Or seconds, number of seconds to respond to a computer task. If someone responds in 0 seconds, that means it took them no time to answer. And they could go off from there. So ordinal, interval, and ratio are all quantitative measures. Categorical, there's really just one type. It's always going to just be groups without an order. All right, so now we're on to reliability. We're going to talk about different types of reliability, but overall it's just, are the scores consistent? Are they consistent? We're going to talk about how we can just look at a scatter plot or use correlation, and then what it looks like in a journal. So first, there's 3 types of reliability that we're going to talk about in this class. First is test, retest. Next one's inter-rater, and the third one is internal. Test, retest just says we take a test at time 1, and then they come back another time and take the test at time 2. And our question is, are the tests at both times, do they correlate a lot? Are they very similar? So if a person scored a 60 in the first test, do they score close to a 60 in the second? The inter-rater reliability usually uses more than one person. And so we get a rating from one person and a rating from another. And we look at, do those ratings line up? So we may wonder, going back to my example of anxiety, do both raters rate the person's responses to the anxious situation roughly the same, or are they very different? The third one, internal reliability. This one's more about a consistent pattern of responses, regardless of how the researcher has phrased the question. So an example of this, a researcher asks in several different ways about how lonely you feel, and your responses are pretty consistent across that. So this one's really common to just do in a survey. You can say, I feel alone, that would be one. I feel lonely is another. I feel like there's no one I'm close to, could be another one. We want to know, do those line up? So we can look if these things line up. In any of these situations, we can look at a scatter plot. So this is our example data, looking at, for Taylor, scored a 50 head circumference, so in centimeters at time 1 and 52 at time 2. Kendra, all the way down. And we can look at a scatter plot. So at time 1, Taylor scored here, time 2 scored, or time 1 over here, time 2 over here, scored there. Kendra, Mateo, and Kurt. So what this shows is that these are roughly along the line. If they're roughly along the line, that's telling us there's not a whole lot of variability. Therefore, they are reliable. They're consistent. So Scatter plot can show us high consistency, or they can show us not. Or this one, they do not line up along a line very well. So we can also look at reliability with a correlation. So correlation here, these dots is 0.56, these ones 0.93, negative 0.59, and no correlation here, just 0.01. So correlation goes from -1 to 1. Closer it is to 1, the higher the reliability. Depending on how you phrase the question, you could also have high reliability with a negative close to 1. So of these three, which one is the most reliable? It would be B in this case. B is the most reliable. So in general, we can look at scatter plots, we can look at correlations, and both of those are going to give us an idea of how reliable our measures are. In a journal, you might see something like this, where it's looking at the internal consistency for the satisfaction with life scale. So there's a high test-retest value, 0.83. The Cronbach's alpha, or coefficient alpha, is another measure. It's very similar to the correlation. It's about internal consistency. And that's really high too. So this measure looks like it's really good. This one looks good too. And we can make comparisons. This one, maybe not so much. The test-retest is not great. And maybe not this one. And that could just be because there's too much time apart from them. So from test to retest, maybe it's too long and things change. So in journals, you can see this. You can look for alphas or test-retest or internal consistency, those terms. All right, so we talked about reliability. Reliability is all about consistency. On the other hand, validity is about, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? So we could have a really highly reliable value or measure, but it totally measures something we aren't trying to measure. And so it wouldn't have good validity. So there's a couple different types. There's face validity and content validity. There's criterion validity, conversion validity. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the relationship between the two. So this slide is showing different types of validity. What we're going to look at in a lot of detail is construct validity. The reason why is in psychology, a lot of the things we're looking to measure are difficult to measure. For example, anxiety. It's this broad term, could mean a lot of things, and it's not something you can just pull out a ruler and measure how anxious someone is. So construct validity helps us get there. We've talked about all of these before, but here we're going to focus on this construct validity and how different things like face validity, content validity, criterion, conversion, all those things that we just mentioned fit into construct validity. So as we're going through these, you can keep in mind construct validity, there's two subjective ways to assess validity. That's face and content. Face is just about it looks like what you want to measure, and content is the measure contains all the parts that you want. Then there's three empirical ways to assess validity, and that is first, criterion validity. Your measure is correlated with a relevant behavioral outcome. So we have something, let's say anxiety. Our measure of anxiety correlates with something that has to do with anxiety. So it could be poor behavior, or it could be poor sleep, something behavioral that it could correlate with. Conversion validity is about how your measure is more strongly associated with measures of similar constructs than of other constructs, which is the opposite of discriminant, which is it's less strongly associated with dissimilar constructs than similar constructs. So in other words, we want our measure to be correlated with relevant behavioral outcomes, and we want it to correlate with other measures of the construct and not to correlate with ones that aren't similar. These two are usually a good starting point. Does it look like it's what we want to measure? So we've talked about these. Both face validity and content validity are subjective ways to assess it. So criterion validity, here's an example, aptitude test A and sales figures in thousands of dollars. So this is looking at, does our aptitude test actually predict how well they do in sales? And here, this one would suggest yes. It's highly correlated. They're all along this line. This definitely is correlated with this. It predicts it. Where this one, test B, doesn't so much. It still predicts it. This still goes in a line overall. There's some relationship, but it's not nearly as strong as this one. So this would say aptitude test A has good criterion validity in predicting sales figures. And this one, you can use a correlation like we did before, or we can use what's called the known groups paradigm. And this is essentially where you look at your measure and how it relates to something that you've already measured where there's groups involved. So, for example, psychiatrists may be very good at understanding who's depressed and not depressed. So what we'd want to see is that our score of depression was different between these two groups. So the depressed group should have a higher score on here than the not depressed group. So we can use that based on their expert judgment. Could also do it this way, where a psychiatrist rating between none to severe in depression the none should have the lowest score, and it should go up somewhat stepwise, leading to the highest score being in severe. So that's known as the known groups paradigm. So the known groups paradigm provides strong evidence for lots of scales, including the SWB scale, so the subjective well-being scale. So we can look at this. We can look at where means are different. So American college students, you'd expect them to be overall pretty normal, fairly high maybe. French Canadian students, about the exact same. Makes sense. You shouldn't have a huge difference between American and Canadians overall. Korean students may be a little lower. It could be cultural in some way. But if we get to Veterans Affairs Hospital inpatients, these are people that are sick. They should definitely be lower than these other ones. And same with prison inmates. They should be lower. Abused women, it's interesting, is higher than this, which could be a surprise. Overall, this shows this measure is fairly good at picking up on individuals' subjective well-being given the conditions that they are in. So when it comes to convergent validity, so we're looking at this depression score, and we're comparing it to this known depression score, the CSD. And so if we saw these results, we would say that they look like overall they're measuring the same construct. They're pretty highly correlated. There's definitely some noise between them, which is something we would probably want to look at. Why is there differences here between here? But overall, there is a good relationship. And then discriminant validity is saying these two, so physical health problems and BDI score shouldn't correlate very well. Physical health problems really could have something to do with depression, but often it doesn't. And so overall, it shouldn't have any correlation. And so a result like this shows if you're trying to draw a line through these, it would be pretty flat. So we have both convergent validity and discriminant validity. There's evidence for those here. So one of the last ideas is talking about the comparison between reliability and validity. So I have 4 different targets. And so we're going to say that these points represent the measures and how close they get to the target, where this is we're around this center, we are measuring what we want to measure. So give it some thought about if this one is reliable and if it's valid, if this one's reliable and if it's valid, if this one's reliable and it's valid, and this one. So first, this one is both reliable and valid. Reliable meaning the points are consistent. They're around each other really tightly, and they surround the center of the target. We're getting what we want. Next one then is reliable. The points are all really close together. They're very consistent, but it's not valid. It is not aimed at the center of the circle. So what's this next one? It's not reliable, but valid. I find that most of my students get confused with this. They think it's not either. But if you look at the center of all the points, it is around the center here. So it's reliable, but not, or it's not reliable, but valid. And then this last one, probably guessed it, not reliable and not valid. It's not reliable because they're spread out a lot, and it's not valid because they're not centered at the center of the target. So in general, we don't know always right away if it's reliable and valid. We usually need to look into our data more thoroughly to find these things out. A lot of research has been done on a lot of measures to show if it is relatively reliable and valid in different samples. And so when we are looking through different articles, this is something to keep in mind, is I need to know what measures I can use for my proposal. And so if they show that it has high reliability and high validity, then you're good to go. That might be a really good measure for you. Those are things to be looking for. So this week we do have the survey due. So you're going to create a short survey, give it to a couple of people, and they're going to give you feedback on it. So you can use measures that already exist that you find in the literature, or you can come up with your own. It's up to you. But overall, this is the idea that you're going to be trying to work with, is you want one that's reliable and valid. So that is it for chapter 5. If you have questions, please contact me. Remember, the survey assignment is due this week. So if you have questions about it, please contact me. If I'm able to, I'm going to put up a lecture about it. But if not, the rubric is already posted to Canvas. And so you can look through what's required of it and reach out to me if you have questions.